videos. Right, so welcome to the Toronto Data Workshop. This is a very special meeting of the Toronto Data Workshop focused on the recent Canadian election, and we're very privileged to be joined to have 4 groups of speakers. Our first is Professor David Andrews. David was actually chair of the Department of Statistical Sciences for some time. He began election night coverage in 1970. He was doing that for NBC with John Tukey. So pretty remarkable link there for all of us. Since 1974, he has been responsible for the decision desk at CTV for all federal and major provincial and municipal elections. So David's going to speak for as long as he likes, but yeah, so something in the realm of 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll take a few questions after that, and then after that we'll go to Dan Rubenson. So David, thank you very much.
Now am I audible?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. This is actually so embarrassing. I'm in the wrong Zoom. The organizers thought I did election forecasting. I don't do election forecasts elected on election night. It starts after the votes have been cast. It's intense activity and it's fun. Now, a little bit of a history. Rohan summarized that. I started in 1970 at NDC with John Tukey and that great loyal Canadian, David Brillinger. There were others involved as well. Since I came back to Toronto, I've been the chief statistician for CTV for all major elections. Last week was my 105th. The client thinks we're the best and keep the team in the game. The CTV decision desk has been supported by many members of the Department of Statistics, including graduate students. Rob Tibshirani, Andre Feuerberger, Lillian Lobchuk, Barbara Thompson, Jonathan Berkowitz, and Radu Kreyu, to name but a few. Concerning the data that I use, I rely only on reliable data. I don't use the results of polls. Polls arise only when I have to correct what pollsters say on CTV, and CTV continues to side with us. Polls aren't random samples. They're opinions of those that respond. It's hard to get a pollster to tell you what his completion rate is because it's very embarrassing. Polls are national. With only about 5 responses in a riding, they're not useful to me for calling candidates elected in a riding. I use only reliable data from reliable sources, and there's lots. Much of this I get from Statistics Canada Elections Canada publications. The rest I get from a seasoned journalist, David Quantz, who's been covering elections even longer than I have. He provides reliable data on every candidate. He reads what's known about all the candidates. He prepares the biographies to be used by commentators on election night. He does a huge amount of work, and he's very good. The prediction system, well, I drafted the mathematics for the prediction component of the election system way back when, and David Wortman from Computer Science prepared that draft for coding. Burton Patkow, a U of T graduate, has maintained the considerable evolution of the prediction system. What do? Well, on election night, partial returns give counts of, say, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 for 3 different candidates in a particular riding. The statistical challenge is to timely decide when a candidate has enough votes to be declared elected. What could happen as more votes or more ballots are counted? The challenge with the recent election was that nobody knew how many votes would eventually be cast. The mail-in votes were not available at the time. The mail vote had recently been very high in British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. So we had to predict under very uncertain conditions. Well, for a statistician, the important thing is variation, and it turns out that variation is very stable. Everywhere, not just Canada, everywhere, politics is tribal. Neighbors talk together and come to share common views on many things. But these shared views vary from neighborhood to neighborhood, even within a riding. There are pockets, small neighborhoods that think and vote very differently even from adjacent pockets. But the culture of a pocket, of a neighborhood, remains very stable. It's basically the same people that came together and lived there for the same reasons. The data that we get on election night comes from small neighborhood polling stations. So they capture and reflect some of the variability that occurs across the riding. And that variability varies considerably riding to riding. So it's important and useful for us, at least, to assess that variability. And fortunately, Elections Canada, even though they don't tell us where the votes coming in, what polling station they came from, they do that for the previous election. And I said the variability is stable. So a review of all the votes of all the polling stations allows one to assess the variability in a particular riding. But the cultures, the people in the neighborhood are very stable. So variability assessed from a previous election is very useful in calling the current one. The biggest decision that gets made on election night is calling the winner, whether it's a minority or a majority government. And this is a sweet computational challenge. Suppose after you've assessed and made a decision about calling every candidate in every riding, you've got a bunch of probabilities. One, the probability that each of the candidates are going to win. And there's lots of them. In the last election, and even in one particular riding, there were 22 different parties. So what you've got is a multinomial, a 22 or 25 item multinomial. And to call a government, you have to get the convolution of all that multinomials over 338 ridings. So it's a pretty simple thing to do, except on election night, it has to be done extremely efficiently and extremely quickly. It also has to be done extremely accurately. There's no room for the time or imprecision of Monte Carlo or Gaussian approximations. There's nothing normal about elections. The calls when we make them are very, very public. The audience is huge. So the neck is stuck way out. so we don't dare make mistakes, and we don't. Fast Fourier transforms seem actually designed for the convolution, but there's better and more accurate ways. The election has changed concerning the nature of the election. After the election, and even before, there was a lot of discussion about how unnecessary and useless and inconvenient the election was, and costly. I disagree. The election has changed the platforms and promises of all parties in what I consider a positive direction, supporting stronger steps on climate, childcare, masking, for example. The greatest changes have been by the leader of the Conservative Party. These changes would not have occurred without an election. Costs, minority governments last only a couple of years. So this election, in terms of cost and in terms of citizen time voting, is not an unusual burden at all. Although unfortunately, some folks complain about having to take an hour or two to vote, the election was well worth it. Party leaders made major changes to policy. That's the good that elections do. The country was much better even on the morning of election day. The election was necessary. Turnout, there's been much noise and press about the recent turnout. In the last millennium, there were 8 elections, and only 3 of those had higher turnout. The turnout of this election was above the median, and that was in the presence of the 4th wave of the COVID pandemic. Suggestions? Well, when I finished studying at University of Toronto, I went to England, and Sir David Cox advised me, work first, read later. So to all of you, I suggest work with reliable data. Avoid polls, avoid news reports quoting self-proclaimed experts, avoid Gaussian approximations. And you too may enjoy election activity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Does anyone have any particular questions, particularly in mind? Liza, did you want to ask?
I think I'm just a little overwhelmed. I don't have a good question. It was such a good talk. Thank you, David.
Well, I've had a lot of fun. I tried to calm down.
David, are you able to stay on the Zoom, or do you need to head off?
No, I can stay on, but as perhaps you can detect, I'm hard of hearing, so I can lip read. And if somebody wants to ask me something, they have to speak very slowly, but I'll stay and listen.
Okay, we'll do that. And if folks have questions, maybe they can put it in the chat, and then at the end, we'll come back to that. So our next speaker is Dan Rubenson. He's a professor of politics, and he loves politics, and he loves surveys, and he's part of the team that runs the Canadian election study. And what that is, it's a really big survey that runs in association with every single federal election. It's been run every election since 1965. And that's the survey that provides us with our best understanding of democracy in Canada. So really appreciate your time, Dan. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. So I would say love-hate relationship maybe with surveys. You know, they have their limits for sure, and David certainly raised some of the limits with commercial polling data. Though the CES, the Canadian Election Study, is certainly not a commercial poll. is quite different. And as Rowan said, this is the CES has been is one of the longest continually running election studies anywhere, really, and has been conducted in Canada since 1965. And does provide, I think, a really great resource for scholars interested in, of course, elections and public opinion and so on, but also lots of other topics as well. And so I'd encourage anyone here who's interested in kind of Canadian social data to download the data, of course, cite the data, and use it, because that's really what we're doing here at the CS, is providing, you know, a public good for the scholarly community. And I think, you know, over the years, the CES has contributed to a lot of important innovations in survey research. Maybe the most influential was the kind of pioneering work by Johnston and Brady on the rolling cross-section design in the 1980s, which is still used in lots of places. And so the current team is, of course, not just myself, but consists also of Laura Stevenson, a professor at Western University, Alison Harrell, who's at UQAM, and Peter Lowen, who is at the University of Toronto, and I think on this in this meeting as well. So if he wants to pipe up with anything that I'm with any corrections to what I'm saying, you know, you should feel free to keep him on mute. So the funding for this, it comes from the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council in the form of various insight grants and also a large partnership grant, which we're also part of, and the CES is kind of the cornerstone of this consortium for democracy, Canadian consortium on democracy, which brings together academics, government agencies, NGOs, and so on to study Canadian democracy in various ways, rather. So I'll tell you a little bit about the CES and kind of how it's evolved and where we're at now. You know, nothing too detailed, but basically these days the CES is entirely online, and that is a change that's happened over time. You know, from early days of face-to-face and then phone surveys. There were often also mail-in surveys that happened, and then some combination of these. So in 2019, we had a phone survey combined with a large online survey. And then now in 2021, it's entirely online. And the reasons for this are many, but a big one is cost, or sort of value for money. And basically phone surveys are incredibly expensive. Online surveys are much less expensive. And it's not at all clear to us and to others that we're getting kind of enough bang for our buck on the phone to justify that cost. And what the online survey allows as well is, of course, much larger sample sizes. And so David talked about, you know, the commercial polling outfits who get, you know, kind of single digit at most, single digit numbers within ridings. We are looking at sample sizes of, you know, 40,000 or so on across the country, where we're able to get, you know, larger samples at the riding level, and then through, you know, MRP methods and so on, are able to get some better estimates of local effects in elections, which you know, certainly Peter and I were really interested in a project in 2015 when we kind of did our own, you know, election survey outside of the CES, where what we really were interested in was estimating kind of local effects, because Canadian elections, as you all know, are really a series of currently 338 local elections. And so we wanted to know what can we know about these local places, and what is the effect of local candidates and so on, rather than you know, treating this as a national election, which technically in some sense it's not. And so the sample sizes we have now allow us to do that more easily. It's not perfect. It's not, there are lots of issues in terms of sampling, in terms of trying to get as representative a sample as possible, and sampling at the local level versus kind of looking at national things and so on. So there's lots of kind of complex things that we try to do to create as good a data set as we can within the limits that we're working, and there are always trade-offs. This year, 2021, we've made a deliberate effort to oversample in urban areas with the intent of getting larger subgroup samples. So to try to get try to enable subgroup analysis amongst visible minorities, indigenous respondents, LGBTQ communities, all sorts of subgroups that scholars are interested in, and also from a policy perspective where we really want to know more about them. The other exciting thing that we do in the Canadian election study is that we allow all of you and others to put questions sort of to, there's a sort of a cooperative design here where scholars can buy survey space, get access to really high quality survey data for sometimes specialized samples at a cut rate price. No, at what we think is a good deal, and we provide some value there as well in terms of programming and all of that. And there are some efficiencies in scale here. Over the years, from when Peter and I started in that model in 2015 through 2019, 2021, there are dozens and dozens of people who have done this and created a lot of value and a lot of output, scholarly output that way. And so that's basically it. We're actually still in the field right now with the post-election survey. So the basic setup is that we survey people every day during the campaign. We had this year in the campaign survey, we had something like 22,000 respondents, and then we go back to those same people. And so far we have, I think, about 15,000 of them have responded to the post-election survey, which is actually much higher than we had expected and higher than normal return to sample, which we're very happy about. And we're going to release the data as soon as we can. One of our kind of commitments to the community is to really release the data publicly as soon as we can. There's no super long embargo period or anything like that. We want to see the data used, and there will be some kind of announcement at some point whenever that happens, once we've kind of cleaned the data and produced the code books and all of that. So I'll leave it there and happy to answer questions. The only other thing I'll say is that I was, Rowan contacted me in early August, I guess, to try to work together to have this like very fun forecasting exercise, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what's come of that. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dan. It looks like Sam, do you have a question? And then Peter, do you want right of reply after that? And I've got a question. David, I'll put a question for you in the chat, and then once we're done with questions for Dan, then I'll call on you. And if anyone else has any other questions for David, then please put them in the chat so he has a chance to read them and think about them, and then we'll get to him. But Sam?
Yeah, I feel like you kind of like touched on this, but I was just wondering what the quick turnaround time of this election, like how that affected the election study, like, do you feel like you guys were a bit more rushed, or do you feel like everything kind of was business as usual, like timeline wise?
Yeah, good question. We were more rushed for sure. I think, to some extent the writing was on the wall. We figured that there was going to be an election, and one of the things which I didn't mention just now is that there's a tension always in the CES between continuity and innovation. Right. And so we have a responsibility to provide this, like we have this continuous data set from 1965. We have a responsibility to add to that time series, right, by keeping a lot of the same questions. So, and in an election study, there are a lot of questions that are kind of obvious, like who do you think you're going to vote for, those sorts of things. And so that stuff, like the questionnaire design is not that difficult, but we also want to, provide some innovation and also capture the sort of issues that are salient right now. And so that stuff, plus all of the stuff that really gets stressful is the contracting with vendors and, that sort of stuff. That's the stuff that kind of takes a lot of time and is out of our hands, and it can be stressful when we can't affect the election calendar. We want the survey to be out on the first day of the campaign, and so yeah, that's kind of it.
Thanks.
Peter, did you have anything that you wanted to add? And we congratulate him on being the new director of the Monk School, and we look forward to all sorts of political science just taking over that school.
Yeah, that's very kind of everyone. Thanks very much. I just had 7 points that I wanted to correct Daniel on. What I wanted, I first just wanted to say I thought David's talk was great, and I think that working through those election calls on election night is that's the real deal in terms of putting a reputation on the line. So I just want to say about the CES, to just kind of underline Daniel's encouragement for people to use it. It serves as an election study, but it's also the longest running sort of window we have into social views in Canada. So there are lots of questions that have been asked about people's views on abortion, gay marriage, right? Their views on people in other parts of the country, which can provide, I think, a really interesting time series if people are interested in studying the overtime evolution of social opinions in Canada, or if you want to look at the geographic variation in them, right? The other thing I would just say is that, we collect a huge amount of, we collect not a huge amount, we collect very precise geographic data. We're all the way down to the postal code. So if you are interested in that kind of stuff, you should be in touch with Daniel or me about getting those versions of the data, because it's there. And for us, the model of the CES used to be that you would do it and then you'd hold on to the data for like 2 years and write a book, and then you let everybody else use it. And as Daniel said, it's kind of 1,000 flowers blooming. We just want everyone to use those data for whatever purposes they want if they're interested in it. So.
Thanks, Peter. We'll just, is there oh, sorry, did you have other things you wanted to say? No. Is there a mailing list, or is there some way that folks can get notified, when the latest releases are coming out? Follow Dan on Twitter.
So, yeah, we don't have a mailing list, but I guess what you can do is send us an email, and then we will. Usually, what happens is, that we would send out a message on like PolMath, and which is the political methodology listserv, like various listservs like that, and the Canadian Political Science Association also has a listserv, and so that's kind of where it gets now announced. But we can let you guys know when that happens for sure. Yeah.
I'm on the PolMath list, so when I see that notification, I'll add it to the Toronto Data Workshop list, and we can go. So I have one question for you, Dan, and then I'll ask my question to David, unless others want to jump in, and then we'll get to the student presentations. But so Dan, I love the CES, as I think is hopefully being clear, and I deeply appreciate the data set. But to what extent do you see the broader Canadian data environment as sufficient. Like, we don't really have something that's equivalent to the ACS. So I would love something along those lines. Are there other things that you think we would make our lives easier?
Oh, so many things would make our lives easier. Flying cars. No, yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a lot of there are a lot of these big international like take the World Values Survey, please. No, take the World Values Survey. It has all of its faults, of course, but Canada used to be a part of it. Then, for the last couple of versions hasn't been. And so I think that's just kind of one indication of that this sort of dearth of data, I guess, in Canada. And, the CES, like Peter said, is a great resource, but I think we are missing other things. Like I think in Britain and in the UK and in certainly the Scandinavian countries, of course, there's much more data being collected by the kind of under the auspices of the National Statistical Bureau, which is missing here. So CDEM, the consortium, which I just mentioned, that Peter and I are co-leaders of with our two other co-leaders, we are doing also collecting data between elections. These we're calling them democracy checkups, and so and those are being released publicly as well. And I think that's an important addition to this. But yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot of stuff that we need but we don't have, and I don't really know what the solution is.
Yeah, I mean, you could have convince more of your family members to run surveys for us. For those of you who don't know, Dan's daughter runs a survey. It's been going for many years. So maybe we should have her on to run a data workshop next. But thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. David, I was just wanting to ask you one question, and then we'll go to the student presentations. So David, given what Daniel says about Canadian federal elections being a series of local elections, which sort of mirrors what you said about federal elections being an election of neighbors, to what extent do you think that we have maybe too much statistical analysis of elections, or how should that affect the types of statistical analyses that we do?
I found the button. I don't think there's a problem with having too much data and too much analysis of things at the writing level. I think if I had a concern about the publication of data, it's the potentially misleading effect of the publication of daily polls, of political polls that purport to reflect changes in the thinking of the voters. And I've been in this so long, I know that people don't change their minds. So at least not to the extent that is reflected by the variation in the published polls. So if I were to change anything, I would improve the critical analysis of the population. I'm not worried about too much information going, as long as the people, it's presented in a way that it can be understood what the challenges are and assessed appropriately.
Thank you very much. So Johnson, are you ready with your presentation? So our first student presentation is going to be Johnson Fu on his presentation, on his model of the 2021 election.
Thanks, Rohan. Hey, hi everybody. My name's Johnson. Thanks for having me. Let me share my screen. I got slides to showcase, and then we present up here. First, I want to give a brief introduction about myself. I'm a third-year undergrad student studying math and statistics at the University of Toronto. Actually, I have a few profs in the call right now. So hi. The main reason I decided to do this competition was merely for fun. I didn't have much work at the time, and I thought this would be a really cool project to do. Having almost no knowledge about elections or doing statistical analysis or predicting any of that sort, I thought this might be a really cool project to do. Which is also why I do not really have a team, since I did this on more of a whim. And I'm very surprised that I was actually chosen to present my work here, as this was a very simplistic model I developed based on the limited knowledge and time I had at the time. Anyhow, for my model, I had a lot of different approaches I wanted to try to do this election prediction, but due to limited resources such as time, I only had a week to do this, as well as being solo. My options were limited to just the actual model I have right now, which used an MRP model. Originally, I had ideas such as using a polls by polls method, which would essentially gather and compile polls from the 2021 election period, and then develop a model that way. But I really had no idea how to gather all the polls together, and then how to reweight them and account for sampling bias and all that. So that was not an option. And another idea was to use some machine learning algorithm using, let's say, natural language processing on Twitter tweets based on the election. However, this would result in me having to find data for each writing, and I don't really speak French, so I don't know how I would be able to do that for, let's say, Quebec. So essentially, my resulting model is a MRP model, since I will only require 2 data sets to use, and was very easy for me to interpret and understand given my limited knowledge. And so the survey I used actually was the 2019 Canada election study. So thanks, Dan, for that. I used this because this was the most easily available survey I could find to use for the Canadian election. And I used an MRP model essentially to post-stratify it, because as Dan said, there's a lot of oversampling in this survey to account for the, let's say, for certain subgroups. And so this will not be proportional or representative of the actual population. And so to perform the post-stratification, I used the 2016 Canadian census, because this was actually the only census I could find that had each individual with their electoral ridings listed. And so based on the model, I end up having 24 subgroups per riding. So 338 times 24 gets 8,112 total cells. And so this will help proportionally represent each riding based on the actual population rather than the bias sample. And so the model I implemented was one issue I had was because we had 6 different parties to deal with, right? Liberal, conservative, People's, NDP, etc. bloc. I did not really have any idea on how to make a model to predict for 6 different categorical parties. And so a few different options I had was like multinomial, but I didn't really know how to interpret those or how to implement that. So the simplest thing I could think of was to implement 6 different models for each party, 6 logistic models specifically, each with the same explanatory variables, this being gender, age, education, and the writing. the writing being based on the previous election's result for that writing, so the victor for each writing. And so originally I used the 2015 election result because I could not find a easily accessible 2019 election results that I can implement. So the model I ended up submitting was the 2015 results. And so you can interpret this model as the probability for each individual in an electoral writing, their probability to vote for a party P based on their gender, age, education, and where they live in. And so I essentially made a model, trained the model on the 2019 Canada election study, and then reweighted everything based on the census, using each cell's proportion to reduce the bias and be more representative of the actual population. And so I ended up having 4 different variables, and the categories being gender, age, education, writings. Gender being only in 2 categories because the 2016 census, for some reason, only was a binary variable, did not account for genders other than male or female. Age divided arbitrarily because it was the easiest for me, and then education based on the highest education that individual had at the time. So this being only high school, bachelor's degree or beyond. And then of course, by all 338 writings. And so by reweighting the model, training the model and then using it on the census, I was able to make a more representative model that would help predict the results. And so essentially the result I submitted was based on the 2015 election. And so the idea was to use all 6 of the logistic models, apply them to the each writing, and then find the highest probability between all 6, take the max, and that would determine the victor of said writing. And so on the left, I have my prediction, the one that I submitted, and then on the right would be the actual election result. And so some of the districts were easily predicted, but then of course Quebec was very well off because since this was based off the 2015 election result, where Bloc Québécois had a very low showing, this model ended up doing really poorly on Quebec, predicting the Liberal Party instead of mostly the Bloc Québécois. But so I decided to manually input and create a data set for the 2019 results, which was more closely resembles the 2021 results, unsurprisingly, and then made a new model based on that. And obviously this model was a lot closer to the actual 2021 results. And so that's all I have to say. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. That was just incredible. So we have, correct me where I'm wrong, Sam, but we have something like 4,000 undergraduates in Department of Statistical Sciences, which means that the very best are just absolutely remarkable. And you're clearly among those, Johnson. To put this all together in a week while you have a lot of other priorities and stresses is just amazing. So thank you very much for doing this. Does anyone have any have any questions for Johnson here? I was wondering about provincial specific fixed effects. Did you have a decision did you make an explicit decision around that, or it just you didn't think of it?
I think originally one of my models was fix the province, but I don't think it worked out very well when I was doing the testing.
Liza?
Hi, Johnson. Fabulous talk. My question for you is, if you were going to give advice to a younger student in the department about trying something like this in the future, what advice would you give them if they were considering taking part in a competition like this?
I would, let me think. For me, I started out very broad, thinking of all the different options instead of just trying to focus on one right at the start, and then thinking about how I would implement each different option. So at the beginning, I talked about the 3 different ideas I had originally, and so I would probably tell them to start branching out, thinking about all the different options they have, and seeing which one was the most realistic, which one was the most practical for their purposes.
I'll ask Monica's question because my guess is that she's with the baby. So Monica asks, if you had 2 additional weeks and access to any data or computational power that you would like, what would you have done differently?
So one thing I really wanted to do for this specific approach was the type of model. So I used 6 different logistical models. That was because that was most simplistic. Because at the time I had only taken a course in linear regression, have not taken SAT 303 yet, which I will be taking this winter, actually. Yeah, and so so a lot of the work I had to do was researching different models and trying to understand them in theory, so I had a lot of different ideas I wanted to implement, but because of the lack of time and knowledge, I decided just to go for the simplistic ones that I could easily understand. If I had more time, I would have done research into like the more complex models I could have implemented, such as I think I had an idea of using a multinomial or a Bayesian type model.
Monica's impressed. David or Dan or did any of the presenter, Peter, any of the presenters have any questions for Johnson?
I don't have any questions, but just to say this is really impressive and yeah, just, great work. So congratulations to U of T Statistics Department for getting your admissions correct. This is good stuff.
David or Peter, do you?
I just agree with Daniel. It's very impressive. Johnson, well done. Yeah.
David, did you want to say anything?
That was a impressive amount of work accomplished in a very short time. You're a brave man. I wouldn't attempt to do that. I think when the election system was built, I spent all February in Sydney Smith feeding decks of punch cards into a machine and getting hard copy printouts. So that was a different time, different experience. You didn't have the time, but to everybody here, I mentioned that it's important to understand candidates, and anybody who wants to pursue this should look at the history of, I believe it was Fredericton, where a Green Party member defaulted to the Liberal Party and the votes followed her. So it's candidates are very important. The other issue in modeling, and it was impressive that you were able to do so much with single party, but the interesting statistical challenge is how do you deal with the trade-offs between the 3 different parties? In particular, when you've got 3 parties, how do you, and if there were only 3, it's still a nice statistical challenge to figure out what's the probability somebody will win. And that's not easily done by doing things one party versus all the rest. Carry on and have fun. Over.
Sounds like you just got a supervisor for your honors thesis, Johnson. So congratulations. No, but I mean, I think it would be great if next time we can be, I say we, like if I can be a little bit more organized and maybe we can try and pair up with some political science students and some of those sorts of Fredrickson sort of like issues we could build into the models a little bit more. Should we move on to the next group then? So our next group is Eric Zhu, Brian Diep, Ashely Zhang, Kristin Huang, and Tanvir Hyder, and they have their model of the 2021 election as well.
Hello. So, hi everyone. It's just me, Ashely, and Brian here today, but yeah, we'll share our slides. So in the interest of time, I'll just give a short introduction. I'm Eric Zhu. I just finished my 3rd year at the University of Toronto in computer science and statistics. Ashely?
Hi, I'm Ashely. I'm in my 4th year at U of T and I'm studying math and stats.
Yeah, and I'm Brian. I also just finished my 3rd year and I'm in statistics and linguistics at U of T.
So we decided, kind of like Johnson, to do this because we kind of just wanted to apply, it seemed interesting, and kind of wanted to apply what we knew from STA 303, which is the course Liza taught last winter, and also to be able to try out some of the other things we learned in class, like some Bayesian modeling. So we're also going to talk about our forecast and a bit of the computational considerations with regards to modeling. So our roadmap is we're going to talk a bit about the methodology, our results, and then we're going to talk about our computational talk. So a bit about problems with Bayes, LME4, and then post-stratifying, and then next steps.
All right, so starting with our methodology. Actually very similar to Johnson, we also decided to do an MRP. And for those of you that haven't seen it before, the first formula is just a general modeling of the formulation. And we can see that there are the fixed effects, which are the xi, and then our random effect, which follows a normal distribution, and variance tau. So what we did was also we ran our data through the model, and then we also did post-stratification on it. As it was mentioned before, the data was not representative of the population, so there may have been oversampling. So that's why we also did the post-strat as well. And then we fit it actually using a multinomial model, and this was for classification of tasks with more than one category. So more than 2 categories. And then, so in addition to that, we can also kind of extend it into a Bayesian formulation, which then we would add the priors onto the betas, which are parameters, and basically says, gives a distribution to our parameter. So here are the model predictors that we use. This is all from the 2019 CES data, which we've cleaned as well. And we also categorized them, such as education, by the level of education, and like languages, whether they spoke English or French or neither. Okay, and finally, our final model. So we used the NNet, which is basically a multinomial model, and then using neural networks. And this is a generalization. Oh, it gives a multi-class of a generalization of a logistic model. And we predicted our outcomes using the predictors that I showed in the previous slide. And then we lastly post-stratified over all these combinations of the predictors. So we had quite a big data set, which was about 7.7 million rows, and that we created our final predictions. And lastly, here are our results. So specifically, we accurately predicted a liberal victory, but we predicted a majority government. And specifically, here are the specific number of seats. So the reason why we had such a big difference was, first of all, we did use the 2019 CES data, so it wasn't reflective of our current demographics right now in 2021, as well as there might have been a high bias, and we only used fixed effects, so we didn't have a random effect in our models as well. And then lastly, the number of factors, we could have included more, which we will be talking about in our next steps. And I'll pass it on to Eric.
So yeah, we decided, so as you mentioned, we had a bunch of considerations. We tried doing linear mixed effects modeling. So we ended up with a fixed effects model, meaning there are some computational considerations that occurred along the way. Okay. So first, we tried to use Stan with the package BRMS. And if you don't know what that is, essentially it allows you to use LME4 syntax to be able to fit Bayesian mixed effects models. It's really great. It handles random effects well, has lots of link functions. It has native support for multinomial regression. The default priors are really good because they're weakly informative and provide a decent amount of regularization out of the box. And it's also really great with model diagnostics, integration with Bayes plots. So you can plot everything with like anything you really want for Bayesian model diagnostics like K-hat and Lu. But the problem is it's really, really slow. So to be able to fit our original model, which had a bunch of, not a bunch, but like 2 random intercepts and a couple of random slopes, it would take 16 hours to fit on an 8-core CPU with 16 threads. And so that's already pretty high end, and it's not very feasible if you're trying to tune your model. So you basically have one go at it unless you're doing this over many, many days. And so if you add, not quite done, but if you add too much model complexity, it'll cause C++ compilation issues because Stan compiles into C++. So if you add something like 2 or 3 random intercepts plus a few random slopes, you won't be able to compile your model. And so you also, and the reason it's really slow is because essentially you need 4,000 independent samples in order to have a decently independent sample overall for things like your parameters and everything else. And so that's why if you have high dimensional models, you're not going to be able to fit it very fast. And that's a problem. So then we tried LME4, but the problem is, we'll talk about the good parts about it first. So the objective function is already penalized out of the box. You can kind of look at that at the first link at the slide. So that's going to give you some regularization, but and the REML that it fits with, which is restricted maximum likelihood estimation, it's actually pretty fast. So if you look at the second link, in comparison to other packages out there, it's only O of n squared times p, where n is the number of samples and p is the number of predictors, and that's the per iteration cost. So it's actually really fast in comparison to other packages. You can fit models within like 30 to 40 minutes. So the problems with it is that it has limited link functions. So you have to do something like Johnson did, which is multiple logistic models. And so you have no softmax links, which kind of drove us to use the log linear model provided by NNet, which is just a softmax link. And we have no good control over regularization. So that was also a problem leading us to using NNet and using ultimately just a fixed model, because we had to use, we really wanted to go for the multinomial regression there. And I'll hand it off to Brian for the next post-stratification.
Yeah, so to discuss a bit of the challenges we had during trying to construct our post-stratification matrix was finding that for every predictor we added and every the granularity, every additional piece of granularity we wanted to add to our predictors kind of exponentially ballooned the size of this matrix to the point that, yeah, it had like 7 million observations, which was very difficult to load into the memory of my computer or any of our computers. So we had to omit quite a few of the predictors that we were considering at the beginning, which I'll also discuss later. But yeah, another big thing when we were constructing the post-stratification matrix was because we were using the census data from the 2016 census, we would have the distribution of each of our predictors per riding correctly, but we would not have the joint distribution of, say, income and education. So we kind of had to, so for the sake of getting this done, we had to naively make our assumption that they were independently distributed so that we could just multiply the proportions across from each other. But that obviously is not the case when so many predictors like income, education, language spoken, province all are definitely correlated, highly correlated with each other. But in any case, we were still able to get a decent proportion of the population this way. And yeah, next. And yeah, so we have some next steps here for what we were considering. So we did use the 2019 CES survey answers. So ideally, we would be able to rerun this model again using the 2021 ones to get better results there. We also would like to re-add in those omitted predictors that we had at the beginning, such as something like sex or employment status or ethnicity. We also have would like the better computational resources and packages to accommodate all of this increased complexity in our models. And also the other thing was to incorporate more predictors that we want to be relevant to election topics. Like for one, the addition of home ownership was something that we considered because that we tried to use that as sort of a proxy for how the housing crisis is a big issue and how people would vote on those lines. But we also considered similar things such for the economy, COVID rates, such that, but we were not able to find data that would reflect that as easily. But and ideally, we would also find a different source of data for post-stratification, such as something like the IPUMS data set or something with a large census where we would be able to get the accurate joint distribution between all of our predictors. And yeah, all of this would have ideally lead to a better model.
And that kind of concludes our talk there. But yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. I think that all of the professors who have done this sort of stuff in the past are just blown away by the quality of this work. So that's just absolutely remarkable. Congratulations to the whole team. Thank you very much for all of the efforts. For those professors who are thinking of recruiting them as RAs, I've already done this. This whole thing was just a recruitment play for me. So you can come to me if you want to steal them. The post-stratification. So just to broadly, so what you do with MRP, this is for the audience, is you run a model and you train it on your survey to use sort of the machine learning language. You train it and then you apply it to a different data set. And that data set is called the post-stratification data set. It's typically large, it's typically high quality. So you typically use something like a census. That post-strat situation in Canada is just, yeah, it's not ideal, right? Compared with the IPUMS. Can some of you get jobs at StatCan and solve this for us? Are there any questions from the audience? David, Liza, Dan, did you have any? Sam, did you have any questions? Liza?
Yeah, I had a question for you guys, sort of similar to the one to Johnson, but because you guys did this as a group, I'm curious if you have any advice about what worked really well tackling a statistical problem and a modeling and computational problem as a group that you'd like to share.
We did this kind of naively. Well, we have like what, 5 computers. So, you know, we ran the Bayes. So I ran the Bayesian model, waited it to finish, and then we tried fitting the we tried creating the post-stratification matrix on Brian's computer, and then we ran the LME for on Ashely's computer. But like again, like the biggest bottleneck here is not so much. Like I guess the model, like it was more so like the model packages don't overlap in the capabilities we needed to. So LME4 can't do multinomial regression, right? So that's a problem. And it rules it out, even though it's fast. And then we can't really do Bayes because every single time like our post-stratification fails, we have to refit the model, right? And then that's another 16 hours. So like if you're working in a group, I think it's like, it's not so, it'd be more like know what you're doing beforehand. And like, you can't really tune your models. Like once you're going, like figure out your computational constraints beforehand and then fit it. Like don't like try randomly fitting it like we did. But you do get a lot of experience with what you're doing by doing that.
Data cleaning was an issue as well. I think we kind of split the data cleaning work among 6 of us, and that was both a good thing because we could split that up, but also now we also have to figure out like a way to join all this data together again, which was an issue considering we had to. Yeah, I don't think at the beginning, I don't think we communicated exactly how we were going to compress some of the census columns between the census versus the CES data set. So yeah, that was a bit of a mismatch that had to get dealt with.
Dan, did you have?
Yeah, just quickly. So again, congratulations to this second team as well for a really great job. So my question is kind of more general one to all of the students who've been working on these things. And so you've all been approaching this as a statistical problem, right? But of course, it has a sort of there's a substantive thing behind this, which is the election and politics and and so on. And so I'm wondering what what are, if anything, and there doesn't have to be an answer to this question, but what sorts of like political things or sort of political sciencey type things were you kind of considering or thinking about as you were trying to solve this statistical problem? Because we could have named this data anything else and renamed the variables and you could have done a similar sort of exercise, right? And so I'm always interested in this because political science is very, very broad, and we have statisticians who work in political science departments, and we have all sorts of different people, from statisticians to computer scientists to philosophers, right? And so I'm interested in kind of your thinking about this, because obviously statistically this is like very sophisticated, and it does have really nice applications to political science. And so I'm wondering, like, if there was any kind of interest or anything that kind of popped up into in your minds when you were working on it.
Have anything?
Okay, so we wanted to model, so the way we chose our predictors, like, ultimately is, well, to begin with too, is kind of along the lines of what would be important in elections. So we actually had much broader plans to do stuff like modeling, more so like housing prices to incorporate that kind of variance into our model, COVID infection rates, COVID impacts, and stuff like that would matter in like the current election. Again, that's not really possible because the post-stratification matrix was huge, right? So it was like many gigabytes. And so R can't really handle that, so we had to leave those out. And so we basically you have to, again, like kind of like with our second part of our talk, like the computational constraints, you have to take that into account and kind of choose your variables, not only like in terms of kind of how much space it would take up computationally, but also like how much they would matter in the grand scheme of the modeling. And we could have probably done this with something like stepwise regression to figure out the EIC selection or VIC selection. But we didn't really do that. We just kind of, went with what we've been hearing in the news and kind of from like a more, social, societal talk kind of perspective rather than having an algorithm determine it.
Johnson, did you have any reflections on Dan's comment as well?
Nothing much to say, not really.
So my thing is that we should try and marry the political science departments and the statistics departments for this type of thing more often, right? I mean, the election, we've probably got an Ontario one next year, maybe?
June.
Yeah. Oh, fixed terms, right. Anyway, so we've definitely got an Ontario one next year, right? So we should probably try and get a bit more organized. Sorry, David. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. David?
Well, yeah, you don't have until next year. I have until October 18th to do the Alberta municipal election. And if you think the federal election is complicated, try and do a municipal election. And the Ontario municipal election has over 1,000 races going. And so it's a computational challenge. I'm impressed with the courage of the presenters and also envious. They tackled huge computations, levels of computation I don't have time for on election night. So I have a very different approach. But if you're looking ahead to covering or working on, say, the next provincial election, as a statistician, I would recommend that where possible, you can use data that's being commonly collected over multiple elections and use not just one election to assess a model, but use a collection, because elections, there's nothing normal about elections, and all elections have surprises in them. The big unknown, this one was the male vote. The political shifts were pretty well understood and easily predicted, but the individual calling was a challenge, but you're not addressing that. Don't face that terror. Well done. Glad to have you on.
So if anyone else has any other questions, otherwise we might just say thank you once again to all of the presenters. Dan, thanks so much for providing the data and all the political science around these things. David, thanks so much for sharing your experience with the statistics around this and realities of election night calling. Really appreciate the students taking the time. If you need a note to, your professors to excuse your lack of homework over the past few weeks, I will certainly write you a note. But the work that you've done is just amazing. Monica's been making comments in the chat, and the reason that she's been making those comments is because it took us 2 months to put something similar together ourselves, right? So what you've managed to do in a week or two is remarkable, and you should be very proud of your ability to do that. And I hope that you carry on with this line of research. But thank you very much for everyone joining us. Next week we will have Fedor. So Fedor's going to come to. So Fedor is a professor in sociology. He's going to talk to us about the intersection of sociology and data science and how those two things interact. So hopefully folks can join us for that. But thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you later. Have a nice rest of the day.